Hello, team. Today we're going to be talking about what is real art and what is art depicting when it depicts reality and what's happening in reality because of art. So, all of these very metaphysical questions, but I think they're appropriate because we're going to be talking first about the Surrealist movement. And here you see Salvador Dali on the right, who's one of my favorite artists just because he's so wild and zany. And then we're going to shift and talk about Hitler's response to art and Hitler's use of art and the Entartete Kunst. We'll get into that in the second half of the lecture. But I want to start with Surrealism because it's very much a continuation of Dada and a extension of Dada, but also perfectly kind of attenuated and fixed to this time in history as the Nazis eventually come to power and the kind of chaos of the state of the world, right? So let's get into it a little bit. We are all probably a little bit familiar with Sigmund Freud and Freud's psychoanalysis. And what I want you to know today, really, about Freud is how popular he is. You understand, everybody's probably heard of Freud, but he really hits his zenith in the 1920s. He lives until 1939 when he dies of mouth cancer from smoking. But in the 20s, he's this internationally famous personality, and psychoanalysis becomes much more mainstream through Europe and North America because of Freud. And this is relevant to us because of how artists used and interacted with his ideas. And you've seen this kind of thing before, but he was more obscure around the turn of the centuries, and artists would have probably had to have read him themselves before this time period of the teens and 20s and 30s. But his ideas have become widely popularized, widely discussed by now. So you wouldn't have to have even read him to kind of know what he's about. We should think about his ideas as being really potent in the aftermath of World War I, especially, because he's basically saying that psychoanalysis can explain and maybe even cure human aggression and human deviance. Deviance, I should say. So you can see how these ideas would probably be really appealing in the wake of the war, that science can explain and treat these kind of problems and make the world a better place. And the Surrealists are basically going to appropriate Freudian psychology. And so, just to talk a little bit about the manifesto of Surrealism, here we have another group with a manifesto. And I am going to post the text. It's long, but there's some major themes that come out of this. There's a huge interest in the unconscious, and you might know that if you know a little bit about Freudian psychology, but this idea that the unconscious or the subconscious is where people's truths really lie, with dreams and repressed sexuality, especially coming out of the Victorian era, this idea of the unconscious holding the kind of key to our psyche. This is really freeing for artists. So if we go look at how they actually define themselves, we see that they say that surrealism is pure psychic automatism by means of which one intends to express, either verbally or in writing or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought. It's dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, free of any aesthetic or moral concern. So basically, they're trying to get at what the brain and what the human psyche is actually up to if you can kind of take it away from the mediating rationality of the kind of conscious brain. Does that make sense? I hope so. And for this reason, they loved getting into a number of different ways to tap into the unconscious. They would do these things called exquisite corpses. I don't know if you ever did this when you were in grade school, but where one person would basically start a drawing and the next person would add on to it with whatever they felt, and it just becomes this kind of odd manifestation of a drawing. And here you can see one by 4 of the Surrealist artists. So they're really trying to tap into what does the human brain actually do when it's left to its own devices. And so they turn to Freud, and they turn to really 3 of his major ideas that show up in the manifesto in a way. So in the Surrealist manifesto. So first is the unconscious, where they're using things like the exquisite corpse game or wordplay, free association, trying to find ways as getting access to the unconscious, also by exploring their dreams. And secondly, if we're looking at the second number here, sexuality is pretty self-explanatory. Freud was fairly obsessed by sexuality as a means of explaining human behavior, exploring urges and whatnot. And it also becomes pretty misogynistic. Freud would explain female hysteria as often due to sexual organs and the essential recognition of her lack of a penis. So this also, if you read the manifesto, can manifest itself in fetishism. Fetishes are objects of particular tactile or optical interest. They're not the same idea as African fetishes that we're going to talk about in that Harlem Renaissance, but I just wanted to kind of clear this. Freudian fetishes are objects that allow for children or maladjusted adults to revisit trauma or fears safely through an object that they can touch. And Freud thought that this was really especially important for little boys' castration anxiety that occurs when they realize that women don't have penises. How did the women lose theirs? At any rate, without getting too deeply into it, fetishes in Freudian psychology are objects that have direct connection with sexuality and pleasure or anxiety. So basically, objects connected with sexual experience. And I think this is going to come into play with some of the art objects that are made during the heyday of surrealism. And then finally, we think about the idea of an artistic genius. Now, it's clear why artists would like this idea. For Freudian psychology, there's this theory of the artist as being this very masculine figure with a unique creative capability. Now, obviously, the idea of an artistic genius isn't anything new. The Renaissance was packed with them, and then the Romantic era, people like Friedrich and Turner saw themselves as geniuses, but that they have this like quality of innate or rare creative power that allows them to make these extremely original creations. But Freudian genius has another element that I think is relevant to bring here. For Freud, genius depends on the ability to tap into the raw impulses, desires, and fears that are seated in the unconscious. So only by giving form to the unconscious can an artist get the kind of authenticity and originality that are essential to the work of aesthetic genius. Now, obviously, this will privilege some artists over others to be geniuses. Only those that have the ability to tap into the unconscious can really create any work of genius. As I said, it's a very masculine ideal, but we will see some women begin to tap into surrealism as a way of expressing their own desire and aesthetic ideas. So, thinking about this, I want to also, if Freud is kind of the psychoanalytic or the intellectual forerunner, I also want to look at the artist Giorgio de Chirico, who is kind of the artistic father of surrealism. He's so important to the later surrealists and is going to show with them at their first exhibition. So notice that this work is 1913. It's a little bit earlier than the surrealism that we're going to see in the 1930s. But I think it's worth taking a look at it here. He's this incredibly metaphysical painter. And what I mean by that is that he's constantly questioning the nature of the mind, testing the limits of reality and time. And we see these ideas begin to emerge in this series of paintings that he did of a Hellenistic sculpture of a reclining Ariadne. Now, this is a sculpture that actually exists in the world, and he is so inspired by it, and he begins to do a number of paintings based on it. And I hope everyone might remember who Ariadne was. She is the one who helped Theseus escape from her father's labyrinth and the Minotaur. She gives Theseus the golden thread, so he slays the Minotaur and he can find his way back out of the labyrinth. But, of course, Theseus leaves her alone, stranded on an island, and does not marry her and become her forever love the way she had planned. So here we see a sculpture of a mourning Ariadne in a kind of piazza with these simplified arcades topped with a clock and a train in the background puffing away. This is a pretty odd painting, right? He's colliding styles and imagery from the past and present. It's ambiguous. Where are we? When are we? he's using a very precise painting style, and he's giving you this illusion of linear perspective, which has been familiar since the Renaissance as a means of kind of uh, representing three-dimensional space in two dimensions. But rather than helping us understand what we're seeing here, those the clarity and the linear perspective add a little bit of confusion in a way. We have this weird, troubling, dreamlike atmosphere. You have these colonnades and a smokestack that you're going to see from a train behind a wall. And in his work, often there are a lot of trains, and this one's hidden. So you have this kind of melancholy. And De Chirico associates melancholy with northern Italian cities in particular, and thinking about the fact that these Italian cities are kind of stuck in the past in a way, if we think about what the futurists were saying, right? But that they're you have all of these epochs coming in, the classical period, the Renaissance period, and the industrial period all coming together. And so you're having a really tough time if you're trying to figure out where you are, when you are. There's no stable location in time or place. And then you have this classical statue of Ariadne with this long shadow that darkens it and dominates the foreground. This is like underscoring the sense of melancholy because she was the Greek princess deserted by Theseus, right? So we have this kind of a dream landscape that's taking on dimensions of fear and isolation in this vast empty space where time is really ambiguous if it's a factor. After all, if you look closely at the clock, it says 2:00. But look at the shadows. Is the clock working? Is it not working? What time is it actually there? When would 2:00 actually have these kind of elongated shadows? So you start thinking about the kind of malleability of time, the frustrations of understanding where you are, when you are, all that. De Chirico really loved these strange juxtapositions of objects like a clock and a statue and a train and palm trees. All of these things are incongruously placed, meaning like, how do they go together? And our brain is really trying to put this together to make a narrative. But ultimately, this painting resists any one clear reading. And I think that's the point, right? There's a forlorn quality of this painting that taps into these kind of unconscious urges or fears that you get when you're looking at it. That there are these emotions that you're not sure what's there and why they're happening. And I think that's why he is so popular with the later surrealists, because he's using these objects that don't go together and making you make the associations, making you try to come up with the links between them, and you try to figure out what narrative is being expressed here. So that's why I'm bringing in this to kind of start us, because I think it's really important, and it's also just plain interesting to me. So now we're going to get into surrealism proper with one of its first practitioners, Juan Miró. Now, there are basically two branches of surrealism, and first represented by Miró is the biomorphic or abstract surrealism, and this uses automatism, which is what? Automatism is basically the dictation of thought without control of the mind. So if you think back to how they're trying to get back to the unconscious or the subconscious, you have these artists that are trying to get through to the unconscious through automatic drawing. So they just kind of let the pen or the pencil or the paintbrush meander along the paper, not controlled by reason. And so you often have these kind of abstract kinds of imagery, and Miró takes it to the fullest extent. The second kind of FYI that we're going to come back to in a minute is naturalistic surrealism, with these very detailed images of recognizable scenes like De Chirico's taken out of context. So you have both sides of surrealism are basically artists trying to tap into the unconscious. But the writer of the Surrealist Manifesto, André Breton, identified Miró as the most surrealist of us all. And he began this painting by making random doodles, which is essentially what automatism is, right? And you have these abstract curvilinear forms that become motifs that the artist freely reshapes on the canvas to create silhouettes, solids, or outlined shapes with these dramatic accents of white and red. And there are a lot of different ways that you can read them, right? They suggest maybe amoebas or amoebic organisms, or maybe constellations in outer space. But Moreau describes his creative process as a switching back and forth between unconscious and conscious image making. He says, rather than setting out to paint something, I begin painting, and as I paint, the picture begins to assert itself or suggest itself under my brush. The form becomes a sign for a woman or a bird as I work. The first stage is free, unconscious. The second stage is carefully calculated. So even Moreau couldn't always explain the meanings of paintings like this one that he calls paintings. They are, in the truest sense, spontaneous and intuitive expressions of the unconscious. In a way, they tap into the unconscious for the artist himself, but then you think about in psychoanalysis, like the Rorschach test, the ink blot test, like how you read these also says a lot about your own subconscious. So it works on both sides. So I also wanted to show you this work. This is by another surrealist artist named Max Ernst, who works in both biomorphic surrealism as well as the naturalistic surrealism. But this one is obviously more representative of the biomorphic surrealism or abstract surrealist work. And this is Europe after the rain. And this is really a poignant piece. This is a kind of reaction to the ravages of war and the bombings that were going on at the time during World War II. But I brought this in so that we could talk about a technique that he used that a number of surrealist artists used called decalcomania. So basically, to make this kind of texture, you paint a surface and then you put paper or wet glass on, or glass on the wet surface, I should say, and then you pull it away, which gives these varying textural effects. And then you can imagine why the surrealist artists would like it, right? Because through chance, it creates forms that may or may not have meanings that the artist can kind of exploit by creating these kind of surrealist or dreamlike or automatic shapes and figures. It becomes another way to plumb the unconscious. And now we're getting into naturalistic surrealism. So this is one of the more famous works in surrealist lore, called The Treachery of Images by René Magritte. And this is interesting because it's a play on words, it's a play on how we interpret reality. But this is a painting of a pipe, right? And then in text underneath the pipe, it says, "This is not a pipe." So why would he do this? Let's just think for a moment and think about how language works and how images work, I should say. And ultimately, this is a very good representation of a pipe. It's like the kind that you get out of a children's picture book, right? But it's ultimately not a pipe that you can smoke. And so it's not a working pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. And in surrealism has a lot of visual artists and a lot of poets, and they're always talking about representation and reality. And so if this is not a pipe, does the word pipe get any closer to what a pipe actually is than a picture of a pipe? You know, what kind of authority do words and images have over reality? And that's really heady, but I want us to think about it, because it makes a lot of sense in a way of what they're trying to get to. Like, what is real and why are the things that we use to denote meaning around us, how did they get there? And how do we understand them as authorities in our lives? And this kind of connects back to Hugo Ball's Caruana performance, if you remember that from Dada, and thinking about how language ultimately makes no sense, right? But we use it to order and structure our lives. And that's one reason why I really love Magritte and love this painting, because it's a painting of a pipe, right? But he's making us kind of think about how we understand what pipes are, what is art, what is language, and how do these things work together to help us to understand meaning in the world around us. So I'll show you one more work of his just because I love him so much. And this is one of his paintings. He did a number of these called The Human Condition. And this is representative of a lot of his favorite themes that are kind of continuing from This Is Not a Pipe or The Treachery of Images. And this is a window painting, a painting within a painting. And he's combining these two themes. He uses them a lot in his work. So you have an easel placed inside a room and directly in front of a window. And the easel holds a painting that's unframed that seems as though, if you're looking at it, it would be exactly what you're seeing if you see the landscape outside the window. So when you first look at it, you just automatically assume that the painting on the easel depicts what's outside of the window that's hidden from our view. But after you think about it for a little bit, you realize that this assumption is based on a false premise, and that is that the imagery of the painting is real, while the image on the easel of the painting on the easel is a representation of that reality. If that makes sense, this is kind of heady stuff. But basically, he's questioning the reality of what we see. How do we trust what we see? There's no guarantee that either of these things are based on reality. Either of these paintings, right? The painting that we're looking at of the window itself, or just the painting that's represented on the easel. There's no guarantee that either of these represent anything in the real world. And both are part of the same painting. Both are a fabrication of the artist. So it's this repeating cycle in which, we have to question what is real and what is representation. And I think that's why he gets into this heady title of The Human Condition, that like we are conditioned to believe and trust what we see. And should we be, that trusting? Should we really trust without questioning and being critical? And that's where I think Magritte is one of the really great artists of surrealism, because his stuff is subtle and it looks pretty simple when you look at it, but once you kind of get into his meanings and when you kind of look at it long enough, it's very kind of unsettling. Okay, and we can't talk about surrealism without talking about Dali and the persistence of memory. This is one of the most iconic, most reproduced paintings of this period. And what are we looking at? We're looking at a scene with watches melting on branches, on sides of blocks, on biomorphic shapes in the foreground, with this pristine landscape painting of an ocean and mountains as the backdrop. So he's using the concepts of hard and soft in this painting. And you can think about this in a number of different ways, as like the human mind moving from the softness of sleep. If you look, this is kind of like a face on its side that's melting, that's on the foreground with a watch over it. Softness of sleep versus the hardness of reality. But you have the persistence of memory as the title. So let's kind of think about this, because Dali never explained his work. So we have to do our best to kind of take what we can understand out of it. If we look, we can actually pinpoint this rock formation in the background as part of the coast of northern Spain where Dali grew up. So it's a specific place from his memory. But then we start looking at the other aspect of the painting, and we see this odd shape on the ground that could look like a human face, eyes closed, eyelashes down, a nose, a mouth. And then you see this weird kind of truncated this tree that's dead, that's growing out of a platform. And you have 3 melting watches, and then you have a fourth watch, I should say, that's closed, and it's covered with ants. And so you have to kind of put together, what is he trying to say here? What is he using all these objects for? And I think first and foremost, it's another way to plumb the unconscious or the subconscious. But you can think about the watches. They've often been interpreted as this kind of unconscious symbol of time and space, and that as they're melting, that the time and space are actually quite malleable. I mean, think about how certain times in your life, time seems to fly by, and certain times it seems to drag by as though it could not move any slower. And I know that you never feel like that in my class, so thank you for that. But this idea that time is not the kind of rigorous thing that this rigorous structure, rigorous authority that we think it is. And also, you start looking, there's a fly on one of the clock and these ants. And what do ants and flies do? But if you think about food, they help things decay, right? They help things to break down. And so you're thinking about ultimately the breakdown of time and space and structure. And it comes in a way a kind of critique of, or not a critique of, but maybe a commentary on mortality and on decay, and how maybe memory is the one thing that actually sticks through our whole human experience, and that's why he named it the persistence of memory. So I wanted to finish our little discussion on surrealism by bringing in this object, Le Déjeuner in Fur, or the breakfast in fur, luncheon in fur, by a woman named Merritt Oppenheim. And I bring this in because this is a really interesting surrealist sculpture, and it kind of ties all of these things in together. So she's thinking about how to put together these juxtapositions, and you're thinking about fetishes and urges, and you think about how fur often kind of taps into this kind of carnal sensation, whether it's sexual or whatever. And you also have the primal urges to eat and drink, right? But you don't want to put those two things together. Would you ultimately like to drink out of this cup or eat off of this spoon? No, it would be a very unpleasant sensation. And so she's thinking about how these things draw together ultimately very different associations, and how that taps into your unconscious and what you're actually expecting when you see these kind of objects. So I wanted to bring that in. And then finally, to finish, I hope that you, at some point in your life, when you are not, if you're feeling like you're into being weirded out a little bit, you can look at some surrealist film. Un Chien Andalou, or The Andalusian Dog, is a surrealist film by Luis Buñuel, and Dali is also in it. But it's a very, very weird and creepy and disturbing film that explores the surrealist urges, and there is an odd scene with an eyeball and a knife that I'm not even going to go into. But the surrealist movement used film as a new method of exploring juxtapositions and exploring the unconscious, and figuring out how to pull together different kinds of imagery and sounds to give you a new experience, and make you kind of jostled out of your everyday life, which I think is key to surrealism. So I'll end this part of the lecture with that, and now I want to move on to World War II and thinking about Hitler. So, I mean, we really know a lot about World War II, right? There was this global struggle between the Allied and the Axis powers. We know a lot about the devastating effects of the Holocaust, the rise to power of fascist dictators. You have Benito Mussolini, Francisco Franco, and Hitler, of course, the most infamous of them all. And then after that, the emergence of the atomic bomb, which we'll actually talk later about the psychological effects about the bomb and the war in general in a later lecture. But today we're going to focus on something that's maybe not talked about as much as the violence and devastation, but something that we're still trying to deal with today, and that's Hitler's obsession with art and what he did with it. So we've been talking all semester long about these big themes that run through the history of art, the purpose of the works of art, whether they're created out of religious motivation, social commentary, out of desire for power over a situation, whether it's over basic aspects of life or political propaganda, whatever. But today we're going to talk about one of the most systematically comprehensive efforts ever by a government to use art as propaganda. And this is a topic that I find very fascinating, and I think it's something that we should all know about, especially today in our era of mass media, where we're literally presented with thousands of images a day, and thinking about the image as a political weapon is key. And this, as we're going to see, this period is really the use of art as a political weapon at its most potent. Okay, so Hitler was 18 years old when in 1908 he moved from Linz and took up his residence in Vienna. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He was planning on making his life as an artist, and he flunked the drawing test and was rejected. He later wrote in his book Mein Kampf that the rector assured me that the drawings I had submitted incontrovertibly showed my unfitness for painting, and maybe suggested that his ability instead lay in architecture. So, with help from a friend, he earned a pretty meager living drawing postcard views of Vienna and selling them to tourists. His paintings were nothing brilliant. They're okay, I guess. But he didn't make the cut. And a lot of people talk about he lived a life of resentment. And it's pretty easy to look back and say, if only he had gotten into the academy, we may have saved several million lives. Ultimately, though, he was rejected. And so soon after, he enlisted in the German army in World War One. His experience wasn't great. He was exposed to mustard gas and a lot of other things, but he would kind of take this as being part of his struggle and part of his formation as to who he became. But let's move past that and get into the Weimar Republic. As if you may remember when we talked about the Bauhaus, the Weimar Republic was a center of artistic innovation and considerable experimentation. You have experimentation in film, the visual arts, architecture, craft, theater, music, and Germans were really at the forefront of some of the most exciting cultural developments. You have unprecedented freedom and widespread latitude for varieties of kind of cultural expressions that lead to this explosion of artistic production. There's really cutting edge work that's being produced. And so you're going to have a lot of people that are applauding these efforts, but then you have conservative and radical right-wing critics that are decrying these new movies and music and dance halls and artworks as decadent and immoral. And they're going to condemn Weimar Germany as this new kind of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they would attack American influences like jazz music as contributors to the decay. So he's going to make a name for himself in the early 1930s. And then on January 30th, 1933, he was named the Weimar Chancellor. And basically what happens at this point is that he acts very quickly to destroy any kind of democratic institutions and take away individual rights. And then his regime quickly pushed through the 4-year Enabling Act, which basically allowed the government to decree laws without parliament. So the only opposition came from the Social Democrats, but Communist Party members had already been arrested and both parties were subsequently banned, so the National Socialists, or the Nazi Party, is coming to power. They're usurping their power through violence and intimidation, and they're basically getting rid of any kind of constitutional blocks that would get in their way. And then they'd begin to push their anti-Semitic views, though it would take some time for it to gather steam, but you know a lot of what happened next and about how with this power, Hitler would eventually become the dictator of Germany and began a campaign about purifying Germany, returning to the roots of the Aryan race. And he does this through a number of ways, right? But one of the ones that's most insidious and how minor it appears from the outset is that he uses his highly biased view of art and architecture and push that as far as it can totally go as kind of a subtle way to control cultural policy. And this has particular poignancy because, as we know, right, Hitler's first and only professional activity between the ages of 18 and 25 before he got in the military, he was an artist. And so his public policies are going to be pretty much in line with his artistic taste, which is pretty conservative. Now let's take a look at how Hitler personally determined the aesthetics of Nazi politics. So he began by having his first Nazi architect, Paul Troost, build a new museum in Munich, which he called the Haus der Kunst. So looking at it, what do you see? What comes to mind? This is pretty streamlined, but it calls to mind, kind of classical architecture, traditional architecture. You can see the classical influence, but what he's done is kind of take away any kind of rounded edges, any kind of ornamentation. This is much more imposing, more harsh, more angular. But at the open of this Haus der Kunst, he gave a speech that reveals how he was very conventional in his artistic taste and how much he disliked modern art. And in part of a speech, he says, "Until the moment when National Socialism took power, there existed in Germany a so-called modern art. That is, to be sure, almost every year another one. National Socialist Germany, however, once again a German art." And artists like Kirchner, who we've talked about, actually comments on this. He said, "There is war in the air, and in the museums, the hard-won cultural achievements of the last 20 years are being destroyed. And yet the reason why we founded Die Brücke was to encourage truly German art made in Germany, not supposed to be un-German. Dear God, it does upset me." So this leads us to, if you visited Munich in the summer of 1937, you could see two spectacular, in the terms of just purely spectacle, they were things to be seen, spectacular exhibitions that were held only a few hundred meters apart. So we know Hitler did not like modern art, and this is very indicative of a strong, conservative, conventional streak in Nazi thought. They espoused old-fashioned traditional values, quote unquote, and modern art seemed not only to run counter to that, but in some ways they thought modern art was actually trying to undermine those values. So this is going to be a part of a major effort that Hitler makes to try to shape the artistic culture of Germany in 1937. This is a key part of his policies that he would actually instigate in World War II after he annexes Austria and Czechoslovakia and the invasion of Poland the next year. So this is all kind of just swirling in the air, right? He's doing his military conquests, and he's also doing his cultural conquests to try and win the minds, maybe not the hearts, but definitely the minds of the German public. Okay, so before he makes moves militarily abroad, he focuses on art at home. So he has these two exhibitions. One, the poster on the left, is called The Great Exhibition of German Art. And this is going to showcase recent leading examples of quote-unquote Aryan art. Then the second is the Entartete Kunst, or the Degenerate Art exhibition, which offered a tour through the art that the National Socialist Party had rejected on ideological grounds. So basically the Nazis, any art that the Nazis deemed not Aryan or degenerate was shown in this exhibition, and basically this is the last glimpse we'll see of a lot of this art before these works disappeared. The Degenerate exhibition was a blockbuster. It traveled to a lot of different cities in Germany, but the first city alone, Munich, saw over 2 million people attend. And here you can see Hitler and Goebbels walking through the exhibition and reacting to the art. But notice here, look at the aesthetics, right? Look at the writing on the wall. Look at the way paintings are hung seemingly haphazardly, crookedly. They're really trying to give a sense of chaos. And so I want you to think about this, because the exhibition is very cleverly manipulating visitors to loathe and ridicule the art on exhibit because it's shown in a very chaotic way. And so in one way, these curators of this exhibition erased the original meanings of the artwork and resituated them, right? So until shortly before this exhibition opened, these paintings and these sculptures have been displayed at the nation's greatest museums, but now they're basically principal performers in a freak show. The shock value was enhanced by allowing only people who are over 18 years old inside the exhibition. So there's this sense, right, that you're only allowed in if you're mature enough to handle how degenerate this art truly is. Inside, a lot of pictures have been taken out of their frames, and then they were attached to walls that were emblazoned with outrage slogans, some in graffiti. And so that kind of gave visitors kind of cue of how to act rather than like walking through, whispering respectfully. People were pointing and snickering and laughing. And so basically what they're doing is to reframe these art objects from being having a status of artworks, and now they're reduced to dangerous or outrageous rubbish. So looking through, for this exhibition, over 5,000 artworks were seized, including artworks by Emil Nolde, Ernst Kirchner, Max Beckmann, and a number of works by artists like Franz Marc Chagall, James Ensor, Andre Derain, Matisse, Paul Klee, Picasso, Van Gogh. And here on the bottom picture in the top left, you can see a Kandinsky, and then on the upper image on the right side, you can see a wall dedicated to Dada with graffiti that says, "Take Dada seriously, it's worth it." So obviously they're ridiculing this and ridiculing the ideas behind modernism. Degenerate art was a term adopted by the Nazi regime in Germany to describe modern art, and this kind of art was banned on the grounds that it was un-German or that it was Jewish or communist in nature. And if you were identified as a degenerate artist, you were subject to sanctions. And this built on some of the artists who made modern art, like Chagall, who were Jewish. And a lot of other folks like Picasso that we've seen were tapping into African art at the time. And we see direct rebuttals to that in this absolutely horrific wall text. I mean, the top left one basically says, like, the Negroidization, that's the word they're using, of music and theater, the Negroidization of the visual arts should call forth the racial instinct of the people drowning in the limits of the blood. And then on the bottom right it says, that's how they saw the world. They were the masterpieces, the master of art of decay that were celebrated by the Jews and hysterical babblers who were paid with the taxes of the creative German people. I mean, this is really disgusting, right? This is the point here, is to shame the artists who make this kind of art and to convince all Germans that modern art like this is a perversion of what it means to be truly Aryan, right? And so if you're looking through here, I mean, they've pasted posters on the wall that are coming off of the artworks. They're really doing their best to make everything here look as though it is a perversion of culture, and that this is something to be ridiculed, and that surely this is of a kind of lower grade of humanity. And this is just part of the really more insidious things, right? This is not taking these artists out in the back and shooting them, although they will definitely do that later on. But this is really making the German people like planting this kind of subliminal seed, right? That the people who would make or like this kind of art or identify with this kind of art were somehow subhuman. So I want you to keep this Entartete Kunst show in your mind as we move to the companion show, The Great Exhibition of German Art. So visual art is clearly very important to the Nazis, and Hitler himself had been an artist, so it's not surprising that they're going to dedicate significant resources here to promoting their ideals through art. So how do you see that happening here? I mean, obviously, what's different in this exhibition from the Entartete Kunst? If you look at the works of art that were glorified by the Nazis and compare them to those that were attacked by the Nazis, the differences usually seem pretty clear enough. That like anything that's experimental or personal or non-representational was rejected, while conventionally beautiful, stereotypically heroic art was revered. And this is kind of an obvious line to be taken by a totalitarian regime, that everybody's going to find these works beautiful and everyone will feel and think the same thing about them without the risk of any kind of unwanted, random, personal, unclear interpretations. This is how you condense the public's mind into falling in line with one train of thought, right? With one set of ideals. That's what they're trying to do here. So, in a sense, the concept of quote unquote Aryan art was defined by what it wasn't. That anything that's ideologically hard or problematic, that doesn't fit in with the beliefs of regime, was moved until there's basically little left but this academic style that celebrates youth, athleticism, optimism, power, and eternal triumph. So you can see this is the kind of art that they wanted to celebrate. And just note that this is the kind of art that they deemed unsuitable for a culture such as Nazi culture. After the exhibit, the paintings were sorted out for sale and sold in Switzerland at auction. Some of the pieces were acquired by museums and others by private collectors, but this is one of the most hypocritical aspects of this that I think is so gross, that a lot of Nazi officials actually took a number of the quote-unquote degenerate works for their private homes. For example, Hermann Goering, which you see here on the left side, took 14 paintings, including a Van Gogh and a Cézanne. So they're saying here, this is degenerate, you should have, but unless you're, powerful in the Nazi regime, you can just sneak a few into your home. But a large amount of quote-unquote degenerate art was destroyed by artists like Picasso, Dali, Otto Dix, Kandinsky, and they had a series of bonfires. They had book burnings. You probably read about that, but they also burned a lot of artwork, which makes me, as an art historian, so sad. But so you now have these avant-garde German artists that are branded both enemies of the state and a threat to German culture. And the government actually begins to forbid some artists from even buying painting materials. And so those who actually stayed in Germany were forbidden to work at universities and were subject to surprise raids by the Gestapo to ensure that they were not violating their ban on producing artwork. A lot of artists, as you can imagine, are going to go into exile, both within the country and outside of it. Otto Dix, for example, is going to go to the countryside and basically paint landscapes in a very bucolic and benign way that wouldn't provoke authorities. Oskar Kokoschka is going to become a well-known anti-fascist. He's going to leave Austria in 1935 for Prague and then London, and then ultimately become exiled in Switzerland. One of the saddest stories from this narrative is the Nazis deemed Kirchner's artwork un-German, and in 1937, as part of the Entartete Kunst campaign, they removed more than 600 of his paintings from public collections, and he basically committed suicide the year after the exhibition in 1938. And so that's why we have so few works of art by Kirchner, is that, and part of the real tragedy of not everyone was killed directly by the Nazis, but, the deaths attributed to the Nazis are significant in themselves. So the war actually brings forth another aspect of art to the forefront, art ownership. And we've kind of mentioned the word provenance earlier in the semester. If you remember what it means, it's the history of ownership of a work of art. And so if we start with the quote-unquote degenerate artworks like this one by Egon Schiele, a lot of the owners of modern art in Germany and Austria were actually Jewish, and you have this rising upper middle class that were huge patrons of modern artists. And this painting had been owned by a woman named Leah Bondi-Jouret, who was a Jewish art dealer who was fleeing the German annexation of Austria and the Aryanization program. And so she was an art dealer, right? And she had been forced to give up the paintings in her professional collection to this art dealer named Friedrich Welz, who was cooperating with the Nazis in 1939. And so all of her professional gallery collection, all of her paintings had already been seized, but Welz saw this painting in her apartment where it was part of her private collection and demanded that she turn it over to him. And so she didn't want to, obviously, but they were going to be fleeing the country any day now, and her husband basically convinced her to turn the painting over to Veld, saying, "You know what he can do." And so, at the end of World War II, the U.S. Army seized Velds and recovered the paintings that he had accumulated during the war, and he had this in his collection, right? But the painting's history gets sketchier and the story gets sadder as another art buyer seems to have been working with Bondi to get this painting back for herself. Only this guy bought it for himself and then eliminated her from the provenance records. And this particular ownership battle, legal battle, was just settled in 2010. And the painting is in the Leopold Gallery in Vienna now. But so just think about how difficult it would be in the course of the war to have all of these artworks and establish proof that they were once yours, right? And to get them back. So this is part of a major legal shift that we're still dealing with. Because similarly, Klimt's Woman in Gold, the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer that we looked at, has gotten a ton of press for its legal history in recent years. Adele died before the war, but basically her husband was this wealthy sugar magnate, and he kept the portrait hanging in his house along with 4 other Klimt paintings. And the Nazis stole the works off the Bloch-Bauer's walls, and Bloch-Bauer fled the country. This painting, along with basically the rest of his assets, was taken over by the Nazis after they gave a false charge of tax evasion against him. And so the lawyer that was acting on behalf of the Nazis and the German state gave the portrait to this other gallery, the Gallery Belvedere, claiming he was following the wishes made in the will. But Ferdinand, I don't know if you're following this, I hope you are, but basically the owner of this had died in 1946, and his will stated that his estate should go to his nephew and 2 nieces. And so it wasn't until 1998 when this investigative journalist established that this gallery owned several works of art that were stolen by Jewish owners during the war, and it was like public pressure that basically made the museum, made the gallery return some of these. And so this is Adele Bloch-Bauer's niece here, who had a really good lawyer that, after going back and forth for 7 years in courts, which included a hearing in front of the Supreme Court in the United States, basically this committee finally agreed that the painting had been stolen from the family and that it should be given back to her. So basically then she took it. She just didn't want a Nazi affiliate to have the painting, right? So she took it and sold the work to a businessman, an art collector, who placed the work in the Neue Gallery, which is in New York City. It's part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But I just think all this is so interesting. These are 2 of millions of stories of theft and ownership of art during that it happened during the war, because Hitler himself was ransacking the museums of Europe. His plan was to create a new Berlin, that would have been near Linz, where he was from, where he would establish the European Art Museum with all of its these major works that he quote-unquote collected. But you can see here that it was to be at the very end of this huge promenade main street, and this was part of his goal for once he had conquered the world, essentially. So it's estimated that Hitler stole over 750,000 artworks during the war. And so basically, the years between 1933 and 1945 are a black hole in the art community, where thousands of pieces of art go missing, they change hands. It's impossible to document where everything went. So some of you may have heard of the Monuments Men movie, but basically there was a section of the Allies, a military corps of mostly middle-aged men and women who were historians, art historians, architects, museum curators, and professors that became the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section of the Allies. And they found and recovered countless artworks stolen by the Nazis. And so here you can see some of the works that they recovered. There's a Dürer at the very top. They opened a mine and found a number of artworks. That's Dwight D. Eisenhower. Down at the bottom right, show you some other images. A Rembrandt painting. Look at all of these artworks. We're actually gonna, there are a number of artworks that were lost in the war that were either destroyed or just permanently lost. We still don't know where they are. But that's a very famous Botticelli painting called Primavera on the left, some Picasso's on the right. The Ghent altarpiece. A Madonna by Michelangelo. The Winged Victory of Samothrace. The Mona Lisa. So, I mean, the number of artworks that were either stolen or hidden during the war is astronomical. And although a lot of these items were recovered by the Monumentsmen Corps, a lot of them are still missing. And so there's an international effort that's going on as we speak to identify Nazi plunder that still remains unaccounted for, with the aim of ultimately getting these items back to their rightful owners or their families or respective countries, you name it. So if you're interested in becoming a part of this effort, you can go and become a lawyer or an art appraiser and join in this. One final story here. Hildebrand Gerlit, that you see here, was an art dealer, and he knew a lot of the Jewish collectors in the area during his career, and he was clearly well connected within the Nazi Party. You can see him here shaking hands with Hitler. But so he would use his knowledge of Jewish art collectors and basically turn them over to the police and seize their collections. And so fast forward, I guess. And in 2010, German customs officers found his son, Cornelius Gerlit, coming back to Germany from Switzerland, and he was carrying $13,000 in cash. And basically he said that what he had, the money was proceeds of a transaction from with this gallery in Bern, Switzerland. And so nothing immediately illegal was obvious here, but the police and authorities began to be very suspicious of him. And so they began to investigate him, and they saw that there were a lot of odd things about his life, that he had never had a job, never been employed, he had no obvious source of income, and he wasn't registered with any tax authorities or social services. He had never been married and had no pension, no health insurance, you name it. So he's basically lived his entire life under the radar of any kind of government authority. And so in late February of 2012, authorities searched his apartment, and they found more than 1,000 paintings valued as much as €1 billion at the time. And some of the paintings were immediately suspected of being looted by Nazis during the war. But it's wild how huge this collection is and how it's largely undamaged. And the pieces are still of remarkable quality. It has old masters, it has impressionists, it has cubists, expressionists, paintings by people like Courbet, Delacroix, Otto Dix, Dürer, Kirchner, Kokoschka, Matisse, Monet, Munch, Picasso, Rodin. These huge names that we've talked about all semester, but they're found here. And so I love the picture here at the bottom where you have these two people standing and just in complete shock and awe of what do we do with this? But I wanted to show this to you, and I wanted to talk about this today because I think understanding how Hitler used art and how art was kind of deployed in World War II, and it will be deployed by other governments in other ways after this and before this as well. It's propaganda, right? But how this works to kind of subtly influence the public at large, and how art, and modern art in particular, were weaponized during the war. It's just something that I think we can't take for granted. We need to remember, because art, even if it's not overtly political, it always can be used for political uses. And I just wanted us to think about that for a little bit today, if for no other reason than to have you, as you go through your life and you go through, your day-to-day interaction with images, be a little bit critical of, why is this being shown to me like this right now? Is there an ulterior motive? And also think, if you make art, think about how that can be used and how the public might perceive it. And I think that's just, really important to keep in mind. And it's one of the great lessons that art in the 20th century teaches us. So please let me know if you have any questions. As always, I'm available via email, most likely. But I hope you have a really good week. Thanks, guys.